Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 30th of July 2015, just after 1 o'clock. And welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host this afternoon, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And behind the technical desk, Nick Green. Well, weather in Plymouth, not too bad, Mike.
It's okay.
It's okay. A little bit of sunshine, a bit of blue sky, a few fluffy clouds. Across the country, mixed reports. Glasgow, I think, a bit cloudy. Rhyl is dry and bright, and that's about it, I think. However, we have been alerted to the fact there's some quite extraordinary weather reports for Scotland, and the Scotsman here picking up on Scotland's weather, snow forecast as gritters seen. So this was just illustrating a gritter seen in the street. But the forecast is that if you're north of the border, you're going to need something under the kilt because it's a winter woolies alert, and Scotland could be hit by unseasonably cold conditions. This is pretty serious news, Mike. Possibility of snow in some of the most scenic parts of the country. Well, of course, we know who's to blame. It's those very naughty beavers. And for any of our viewers and listeners who haven't yet picked up on it, according to the Daily Telegraph, the beavers have been causing global warming. How does that fit in with snow, Mike?
You're in the past. It's climate change, not global warming.
Okay, climate change. Hence the snow, hence the beavers. Well, there we are. Where do we go from the weather?
Well, on the children, just people are asking, by the way, if there's any news on the Benfellows case. Just before we came on air, still no news from Exaro or anybody else about what's been going on. Jury's still out, as far as we know.
Yes, okay. Well, if we get any, or as soon as we get news, we will report on it. But of course, one of the things UK Column has been pointing out, that after the initial blast of publicity, which was all across the mainstream press, fantasy, Benfellows allegation, fantasy, no reporting. And it's taken a couple of amateurs, but very good little interviews done outside the court to show that there was some extremely interesting information coming into the court. But mainstream press and media silence. I wonder why.
Anyway, this is an interesting story from the Press Gazette. Marion Jones, ex-BBC presenter, saying that everyone on the correct side of the Savile argument has been forced out of the BBC. He's saying that a number of people have lost their jobs, really not through being sacked or made redundant, but just that the culture within the BBC and the life that they were being subjected to while in the BBC was such that they felt they had to go. He said that everyone involved on the right side, as it says here, was forced out. He said he called it drip poison. And it made life hell, and he considers people, he was considered traitors to the BBC, he and others. So pretty nasty culture at work there. People said they won't sack you after Savile, but they will make your life hell. Everyone involved on the right side of the Savile, that's what he said. I went to an employment lawyer. He said if you sue the BBC, you will win. However, it will take a year and the BBC will settle on the steps of the court. I thought about it, and I thought I'll take voluntary redundancy and go in that case. So, but he wasn't the only one.
No, there was a whole range. If we just bring up the Daily Mail here, they're also, of course, reporting this story. If you go to the Mail, and I'll encourage you to go and have a look at this one, there's a whole section with photographs of the other journalists, BBC journalists who were involved. And the Mail also put up this little timeline to show how the thing unfolded. But what a statement, Mike, that anybody who speaks out about child abuse in the BBC, that's treason as far as this organisation is concerned. So the BBC that can't report real treason by the British government, but if you dare to try and protect children, then the BBC is going to throw you out. And what was it, BBC Radio 5, I think it was, that closed down on the Oxford and Cherwell Valley College abuse case because they said, well, we went and talked to all the authorities. They said they hadn't done anything wrong. And then the journalist, can't remember her name, but young lady, simply said her boss pulled her off the case. Yeah, pretty obvious. Well, what has the BBC been up to? Well, while it's been sacking its own people who've been trying to protect children, the BBC, in our mind, is busy on another propaganda campaign to get the public mind to think that child abuse is somebody else's problem. So here's BBC News, sex trafficking, lifelong struggle of exploited children. There's embedded video clips. Now, is this talking about Britain? Absolutely not. This whole article is to do with America. And here, excuse me, here it is. It's a worldview few Americans are aware of, but tens of thousands of American children are thought to be sexually exploited every year. It's believed every night hundreds are sold for sex. The FBI says child sex abuse is almost at epidemic level, despite the agency rescuing 600 children. Well, it's all to do with America, and of course the BBC will not investigate Westminster. Ian Purnell is the man here. And what is the game? It's distracting the public away to America so that we protect the paedophiles operating in Westminster. And of course, unlike the FBI, the Metropolitan Police at the moment simply refuse to get in there and investigate properly. And I can tell people live on today's programme that pretty vicious threats, abuse and intimidation going on inside the Metropolitan Police to silence Met police officers who have started to speak out about child abuse and the fact that there has been a massive cover-up, not only by senior officers in the Metropolitan Police, but of course that's linked through to connections inside Westminster. Threats and intimidation of Metropolitan Police officers by senior colleagues to silence them on what's happening with child abuse.
So this really nasty vitriolic culture that is in the BBC seems to be in each of the sort of institutions that have helped cover this this issue up. Well,
this is the key thing, Mike. I just give it as a personal opinion. It's my personal opinion that it's a fallacy we're dealing in paedophile rings, because what we can clearly see is that the very institutions that should be protecting the children are part of the paedophile activity. So is it a ring of dirty old men in raincoats? Don't think so. What we've got going on here is establishment sanctioned child abuse, where of course vital public protectors, or they should be the police, are clearly heavily involved in the abuse of the children.
Do you think this is a recent thing that's happened, that these people have wormed their way into these organisations, or have they always been like this?
I'll come down the middle. If you say that they've wormed their way in, this is not something that's happened over the last few years. This is something that occurred soon after the organisations were set up. I think we're looking at something very dark and dirty. Charities set up to protect children, I don't believe are protecting the children. I think they're procuring the children. And basically social services there to protect families, well, they're not. And no, that doesn't mean that all social services people are bad, far from it. Well, let's follow through with this BBC story. As we always like to do, let's get a picture of the man on screen. Here he is, Ian Purnell, BBC international correspondent. And he says retweets are only of interest, nothing to do with me, don't endorse them. Well, he's a fascinating man, because if you've forgotten, this is the man who claimed all the fame for the big story on the Aleppo school bombing.
This is the Aleppo school bombing story, which was broken on the day of the parliamentary vote about whether to bomb Syria or not. And of course, the timing of that was not coincidental at all, was it?
Well, we don't think so. And we've recently seen some freedom of information which shows that basically the BBC being questioned on this news report, and the inference is that video clips that were put to the public as if they were filmed on location at the time, so this is real live footage, was nothing of the sort. It was heavily edited by the BBC to give the BBC opinion. So dangerous stuff. Well, let's have a look at what he was doing, if we may there, Nick. This is a number of organisations that he mentions in the article. So we've got Samaritan Women. We've got this one here, Breaking Free. And there was another organisation that he mentioned called Angels of Addiction. But when we went looking, we got the error message in the bottom right hand of your screen there. We did find something about them on Google. They appear to have been working in Baltimore's neglecting neighbourhoods. But fascinating that this high-profile BBC correspondent, he's not doing anything to do with child abuse in UK. Let's pull it all over into the States. And what is the BBC up to? This is not accidental, Mike, not in my view. No. I think this is propaganda to skew public opinion. Meanwhile, we've got this going on. So big article by The Guardian, child safety worry after inconsistency in releasing paedophile information. This is all to do with the NSPCC because they've suddenly stood up and said that the police across UK won't release information on the location of paedophiles, which they should do under the so-called Sarah's Law, according to NSPCC. But isn't it remarkable that what the BBC, what NSPCC and even the Met Police don't want to talk about is that in the recent Lambeth case, Dame Platt, who's a trustee with NSPCC, is implicated in a story that child abuse in Lambeth was covered up when she was social services inspector. So NSPCC hammering the police, but there's no mention of people inside NSPCC where there's serious questions being asked. And we've got abuse victims who've contacted the UK column, highly suspicious, I have to say, of the NSPCC, and even alleging that paedophiles later went to work inside NSPCC. But we haven't got further information on that at the moment. Be interesting to see where that goes. And just to make sure we know the story's been fully pushed to the lowest possible level, here's Plymouth Herald. And what is NSPCC saying? That Devon and Cornwall Constabulary are top of the list when it comes to refusing to give out information on paedophiles. So the NSPCC singled out Devon and Cornwall Police. They've had 494 applications for information on paedophiles between 2011 and 14, but only given 12 disclosures. So just 16% of nearly 5,500 applications to 33 forces. Interesting number there, 33 forces was successful. So this is Devon and Cornwall Constabulary that could manage 4 officers to threaten to smash down the door. Oh, I believe there was 8. Okay, 7. We're having to use UK column intercom, which is largely visual, having trouble counting the fingers there. But essentially 7 Devon and Cornwall officers sent to our offices to threaten to smash down the door if we didn't provide information on child abuse victim Melanie Shaw. So don't want to give out information on convicted paedophiles, but when it comes to rounding up the victims, Devon and Cornwall Police are your people. Well, as we usually do these days, a quick advert for UK column. If you like what we're doing, have a look at the website. Still people following us on video, but not really having a read of what we're publishing. Please have a look at that. And one of the key articles at the moment is the fact we've written an open letter to Justice Goddard asking what her inquiry is going to do to protect child abuse whistleblowers such as Melanie Shaw. They say they can reply in 15 days if we're lucky. Yeah. But clearly no urgency on protecting people.
Don't forget the book.
The book, thank you very much. We'd like to thank the lady that turned up a few days ago and delivered us a variety of books. Some of them clearly fascinating, some of them rather frightening, such as this one here. What we've got is Tony Blair's A Journey. I haven't read this book. I am going to read it because I've discovered all sorts of dirty little secrets come out in these books. But the most frightening part of this book is actually on the back cover. You won't be able to read it, so I shall read the little text down here. It says, on the 2nd of May 1997, I walked into Downing Street as Prime Minister for the first time. I had never held office, not even as the most junior of junior ministers. It was my first and only job in government. And that has got to be one of the most scary statements going. A man who took Britain to war, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, under lies, false pretenses and against the law. And he came out of nowhere, and now he's, what, a Tesco salesman in the Middle East or something?
No, not anymore. He's
Oh,
resigned
he's been
from that
sacked,
job.
has he? Right.
Yeah. Friend of Ken Clark's as well, we should say.
Big friend of Ken
passing.
Clark. So we might have a look at some of the other books tomorrow and in the next few days. So thank you very much.
Okay, war then, because rumours of war continue to build. This is Russian Insider blog, which is a pro-Russia blog published in the United States. And this blog is talking about the recent new Russian maritime doctrine that Putin approved on 4 days ago. He says in this blog post, on the whole, there's nothing earth-shattering in this document except for one line. And he's translated the line as, a defining factor in our relations with NATO remains that for Russia, the following is unacceptable. The alliance is planned to move its infrastructure to the borders of Russia and the attempts to give the alliance a global role. So Putin, a few days ago, really pretty unhappy about that. The blog post here makes the point that Russians tend to be pretty precise with what they say. And so when they're saying that, so they say when this official president-approved document says that it is unacceptable for Russia that NATO is trying to grant itself a global role, this is at least as official a statement as any public declaration by Sergei Lavrov, for example. Now, Lavrov wasn't present at the meeting that approved this document, but a number of others were. Putin himself, Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin, Deputy Minister Sergei Shoigu, Russian Naval Commander Admiral Viktor Cherkov, and a number of others. And the blog says, in other words, these are the men who would be in charge of fighting NATO should a war break out, and so on. Now, of course, what are they talking about? They're really getting upset about NATO's activities. NATO, again, right up against the Russian borders, this time training Georgian troops. They've just published, this is a couple of stills from a video that they published today. This is regarding NATO actually assessing Georgian troops' capabilities, watching them on military exercise and giving advice and so on. So NATO active in Georgia. And let's not forget that Georgia was the location of the South Ossetian War in 2008, where this was really the first attempt to have this kind of activity on Russia's borders, where Mikhail Saakashvili, who was the president of Georgia at the time, and absolutely a stooge of George Soros, was deployed to try to stir up and start a war with Russia in 2008. And this is really, we're seeing the continuation of that policy. Now, Russia is not standing for it, and they've started kicking out various non-governmental organizations that are working within Russia to try to destabilize the Putin regime. This is Dynasty, one of the NGOs that has been kicked out recently. This is another one. Actually, this is related to the Dynasty Foundation. This is Sreda. And of course, yesterday, the latest one is the National Endowment for Democracy. This is one of the really major global NGOs funded directly by the US government, really pushing forward the same types of activity as George Soros's Open Society Foundation, the same type of activities, pushing for coloured revolutions in various countries. And so they have been kicked out as well. We've been hearing rumours that Putin was working to push out some of these NGOs over the last few weeks, and we're starting to see that happening now. And in the meantime, the propaganda just continues. Does the Kremlin have a new way of hacking the West? This is Foreign Policy magazine pushing a new hacking team that is linked to the Kremlin apparently, and who is actually pushing this information through Foreign Policy magazine? It's this organisation, FireEye, which is a cyber attack specialists, they call themselves. But who are they? Well, they're a relatively new company, and unsurprisingly with CIA ties. Now they're pretty upset. They were pretty upset when Bloomberg Businessweek published this headline. So much so, in fact, that actually since this headline was published, Bloomberg changed the headline. But nonetheless, they do point out the links between FireEye and the CIA. And here's another example of it. CIA investment firm announced a strategic partnership with FireEye Inc. malware protection. And so we've got a CIA-linked company pushing information into Foreign Policy magazine, and that's just being published verbatim, really. Today we've got the Foreign Office tweeting out it's a year since the downing of MH17 in Ukraine. I do apologise. So the Foreign Office pushing more of this propaganda against Russia. You can understand Russia's point of view. I think I've said this a number of times.
One of the things we can say is that if you just do the research yourselves on all these articles, the truth comes up to the surface pretty quickly. Have a look at, if you read an article, just look at what organisations are mentioned, and in particular where information has come from. Go and do a Google search on those organisations, and you will see surprising things emerge. So we thought we'd give you an example. So here is a Sunday Times article. Now, this actually was a Sunday Times that was left in a pub. And this article was top of the pages. Somebody obviously been reading it, finished their beer, put it down. What have we got? Drone strikes kill UK jihadists. So it's a pretty upfront headline. We've already labelled it there propaganda. Can we justify that? Well, let's have a look at what's going on in this Times article. So the key bit is that basically the family of a jihadist believe he was deliberately assassinated on July the 4th in a target killing sanctioned by the Pentagon. And then a second British fighter from Cardiff was picked off 3 days later. Notice the language, another precision strike in Raqqa, the de facto ISIS capital.
Can I just ask, was that a Freudian slip, calling the Pentagon the Pentagram?
Did I do that?
You did, yeah.
Well, that must have been entirely Freudian there. And it goes on here. We've got Whitehall sources. We've been very clear in advising people not to head out to Syria. By crossing that line, they are fighting for the enemy. So if you go to Syria, as far as Whitehall's concerned, you've become an enemy, and you're quite entitled to be simply killed. There's no justification of it. So here we've got the targeted killings are the first of their type involving British citizens in Syria. And it goes on with some very interesting information. America is not obliged to inform Britain if it intends to target British citizens. So it's Syria at the moment, but presumably if you were in Egypt or you were in the Middle East and the Americans decided they don't like you as a British citizen, they can simply kill you. The UK government refused on operational grounds to say whether any intelligence had been shared with America before Aziz and Khan were killed. The coalition forces are taking action against ISIS in Syria, and there are clear legal grounds for this approach based on collective self-defense. So the words are in the article, but there's absolutely no substance. There's no legal proof as to what's going on here. But we're now saying that if you're in Syria, you can simply be killed by the Americans as a British citizen. Not to worry, the British government's quite happy with that. Mm-hmm. So what else did we discover in this article? Well, you can't see it on screen, we'll just highlight it. There was a little inset box there, And what was this talking about? Well, it gave a lot of statistics, war on ISIS by numbers, Britain's fighting for ISIS 700, coalition strikes 5,574, military campaign 350 days, estimated ISIS deaths up to 13,000. So there were the figures. There was nothing to substantiate it, but the source at the bottom was airwars.org. Very, very small print, difficult to even see in the original printed article. So what did we discover when we went to have a look at that? Well, here's Air Wars. It says it's monitoring the international coalition's airstrikes against Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, archiving and official reports of the war, verifying claims, promoting accountability of the US and its allies. That's what it says. Well, what can we discover about Air Wars? Well, it's a collaborative, not-for-profit transparency project. Sounds good, Mike, doesn't it? And it's aimed at tracking and archiving the international air war against Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And it says with a dozen nations reportedly bombing, there's a pressing public interest need for independent, trustworthy monitoring. So they're independent, they're trustworthy, they're not-for-profit. Well, let's bring this in. What does it say here? As we explain more fully in our mythology, our data is drawn heavily from US and allied military. So the information they're pulling out is coming straight from government sources, in particular the US and allied militaries. And if we just bring in the last bit, are they independent? Well, no, they're receiving generous funding from the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, which is pretty interesting. Who are the experts that this organisation are using? Well, it gets even better, because essentially the independent reporting is all by ex-BBC journalists. So we've got Chris Woods here, he's ex-BBC Newsnight. Basil Simon, he's ex-BBC News Labs. We've got Lataf Habib, if I've got that right. He's reported and worked for the BBC. And then we've got a specialist Dutch Syrian journalist, and she's a former BBC Panorama person. So it's all pretty independent, Mike. Yep. Get your information from the US military, mess it around a bit, push it out, get it published by the Times, independent, trustworthy reporting. And if you're not sure about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, just have a look at their website, because they're all about change, and they want to solve social problems in UK, it appears. Here's some of the trustees. Do have a look at them yourself. And we're a bit puzzled because all of the money comes from Joseph Rowntree originally, who was a Quaker. He wanted to help people in a social sense in UK. He actually said he wanted his money to be used to tackle the root causes of social problems rather than treating their symptoms. So his money is now being used to help report American military reports on ISIS. It's a bit confusing.
I noticed the figures did not include how much money we've contributed to ISIS in the first place.
Well, no, we've also got President Obama saying that that America is supporting ISIS and helping to train the troops. So we help to train the troops and then we go and kill them. Okay, well, it's a sort of death culture, really.
It is. And I mean, we commented on this installation at the Tower of London at the time of Remembrance Sunday and so on. This river of blood in poppies that was installed there. Well, you'll be glad to know that it is being taken around the country now, so everybody gets their chance to
see
some death. Yeah. That's really all I want to say on that, because this is the 1418 Now charity organisation, non-profit, which is supposed to be celebrating the First World War.
1418. We want the First World War and all that carnage now. Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
This is an interesting article from Liam Halligan, who usually has his finger on the pulse. And he's talking about, it's headlined, "Watch out when the attention turns to Britain's huge deficit." Now, which deficit is he talking about? Because normally the deficit which is discussed is the government deficit. But he's talking about the current account deficit, which is the difference between the current account is the difference between imports and exports, and we've been in deficit on that for quite a long time. And he's saying the longer we wait before raising interest rates, the higher the risk of a balance of payments emergency and a currency collapse and aggressive rate rises. So he's saying the pound rose sharply last Wednesday on speculation that the Bank of England will soon raise UK interest rates. The 9-strong Monetary Policy Committee was unanimous in its decision to keep rates at 0.5%. The newly published minutes of its July meeting showed this was as expected. And then he points out that quite a number of the members feel that interest rates are going to have to rise in the not too distant future. Now, we've heard Mark Carnage talking about this and saying that when the rise comes, it won't be that severe. But nonetheless, Halligan here is pointing out that perhaps that's not quite the case. He's saying that while it's unfashionable to talk about the current account these days, now that sterling is no longer a fixed exchange rate, I make absolutely no apology for pointing out that the UK's currently sporting a huge balance of payments shortfall. In 2012, the external deficit was 3.5% of national income. Then it grew to 4.7%. Last year, it was 5.9%, the worst performance on record. As the Eurozone has tanked, a weaker euro and a stronger pound have pulled apart our exports and imports. This year, as long as the rate rise speculation continues and sterling keeps rising against the euro, our external deficit could get even worse. For many years, the UK has run a deficit on visible trade like goods and raw materials. This won't be reversed anytime soon, seeing as our last surplus on manufactured goods was in the early 1990s, and we're now a net oil importer. And what he's really pointing out here is that if this situation continues to go, there's going to have to be a massive increase in interest rates, a sudden massive increase in interest rates, not a slow, gentle increase, as the Bank of England is suggesting. This would result in the pound dropping fast, causing import price and inflation to spike, and causing the Bank of England to take nasty emergency action, is how he's putting it. He's saying that he's not saying that this scenario is one which will play out. I think he's warning quite rightly that it is a possibility. I think it's a pretty strong possibility, and I think we're going to see people with mortgages suffering in the not too distant future, because it is a quite likely scenario that he's proposing here.
Well, of course, the austerity measures can be used to drive anything, and we can give an example of what's going on at the moment. What better place to start than Sarah Thornton, former Chief Constable from Thames Valley Police. Remember, this is the police force with an appalling record for protecting children, not protecting children. So she's promoted to become big boss of the replacement for private company ACPO, so the National Police Chiefs Council. And she says we've got to reimagine policing. And because of the budget cuts, we're going to simply not bother to investigate burglary. So this is pretty explicit. There's just not enough money for the police to do their job. She gets paid £252,000 a year, but there's not enough money to police. So they're going to have to shift their focus away from traditional crimes, and they're going to focus on the really important things: sexual offences, terrorism, cybercrime. That's where we really need to focus. So nothing on fraud and corruption, nothing of any substance on dealing with paedophiles in Parliament or Westminster. We're going to reimagine policing, and presumably we're going to imagine that there is no more burglary.
I'm sure they can imagine statistics which will demonstrate that.
Yeah. Don't forget, this lady is deeply common purpose trained. She's a specially selected future leader. So there we are, trained by political charity Common Purpose to reimagine that we don't really have a problem with crime. We're going to get on to cyber crime, and it's difficult to report the news actually at the moment because it's so obvious something's deeply wrong in the country. What about a bit of air safety, Mike?
Oh, this is incredible. Because MH370 has been found. There you can see it.
That's it.
That is it.
Yeah.
That is it. So suspicious. The relatives are suspicious, as you might expect, because this is the only bit that they're claiming to have found. But that is enough to say that the aircraft has been discovered. Just to put it in a little bit of perspective, I mean, some of the photographs that have been doing the rounds of the mainstream media are amazing, as 6 or 7 people carry this very small piece of aircraft. There's no way of identifying where this piece of metal has come from. It does seem to be a piece of a Boeing 777, that can be said, mainly because they're saying that there is the number 657BB stamped on one part of that. Now, just to make sure you understand which part of the aircraft this piece of metal has come from, if you look at the top left of this diagram, which is from the Boeing Aircraft Maintenance Manual, it is the bit which is labelled with the letter A, a bit from the inboard wing, and the bottom diagram shows what it actually looks like. And shows that the number 657BB is actually attached to one of the parts that makes that piece of wing up. And so the aircraft has been found. We can all celebrate that, and the people that have been affected by the loss of their loved ones can rest now, apparently.
So that little bit of wreckage just gently floated to the ground on its own and just dropped onto the grass.
There is no explanation for that at this point. I should say that this was found on an island in the Indian Ocean. So, you know, just magically appeared and was magically found today.
Magic. Well, there you have it. Pretty gloomy news. There is a reason for what's happening in UK, and of course that reason is that there is a war going on against us, the British public, by our own government. So if it's fraud, corruption, lies, propaganda, abuse of children, of course, manipulation of money to the entire satisfaction of a criminal banking industry, the British government is at it. And I'll just give you a last look at this book. This is Tony Blair's book, A Journey. We are not suggesting in any way that any of our audience are foolish enough to buy it, but I'm sure you could get a pretty cheap second-hand copy, or
get it from the library if you're interested.
But I'll wipe the book down carefully after I've read this one. Pretty impressive, isn't it? He's got a lot to say about himself.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. We will be back same time tomorrow. If you haven't visited UK Column website before, please do. And if you like what we're doing, please consider taking out a subscription or making a donation. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.